In the summer of 1683, the heart of Europe trembled. From the plains of the Balkans to the banks of the Danube, whispers carried a single terrifying message. The Ottomans were coming. And this time, they were coming in numbers the continent had not seen in a century. At the head of this massive host was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man driven not just by duty, but by ambition. He had gathered an army so large that even seasoned chroniclers struggled to believe the numbers. 150,000 soldiers at minimum, perhaps closer to 200,000. Janissaries, the Sultan's battle-hardened infantry, marched in perfect lines. Sipahi cavalry, armored and glittering in the sun, rode alongside Tatar horsemen from the steppe, whose very name struck terror into villagers. Behind them rumbled the siege engines, cannons, and wagons laden with timber to build trenches and fortifications. This was not merely an army. It was a tide of conquest rolling north, and its target was clear: Vienna, the jewel of the Habsburg Empire, the last great bulwark protecting the heartlands of Europe. Inside the city, panic spread like wildfire. Vienna was no ordinary town. Its walls were thick, its bastions formidable, but no fortress could withstand a siege forever. Emperor Leopold I, fearing not only his own capture but also the annihilation of his dynasty, made a decision that shocked many. On July 7th, he fled the city. Taking his court and his closest nobles, he abandoned Vienna to its fate, retreating westward to safety. To the people left behind, it felt like a betrayal. Their emperor had deserted them in their hour of need. What remained inside the city was a skeleton force: 15,000 professional soldiers and perhaps 5,000 citizen militia. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants now stood side by side with trained soldiers on the ramparts. They were led by Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, a man barely 36 years old, but with a reputation for steel nerves and an iron will. It would fall to him to hold the line against the most powerful army in the world. Imagine the fear of those citizens as the Ottoman banners first appeared on the horizon. Villages had already been burned, churches plundered, and refugees poured into the city with tales of brutality. Every report made the invading force sound larger, more unstoppable. And when the horizon finally darkened with the tents and pavilions of Kara Mustafa's army, stretching for miles in every direction, it was no longer rumor. It was reality. The stage was set. Vienna, underdefended and isolated, would be surrounded by a sea of silk tents and crescent banners. Its people would face hunger, disease, and constant bombardment. Outside its walls stood an army that believed Europe itself was within its grasp. Inside the walls stood men and women determined to resist, knowing that if Vienna fell, there would be nothing left to stop the Ottoman tide from reaching the very heart of the continent. The fate of Europe now hung by a thread, and the storm was about to break. The siege begins summer 1683, when the Ottoman army encircled Vienna in mid-July. It was as though a living wall of steel and fire had closed in on the city. Kara Mustafa Pasha ordered his vast host to establish an enormous encampment, rows upon rows of pavilions, from the humblest tent of a Tatar horseman to the silk canopies of Ottoman nobles. Soon, the countryside around Vienna was transformed into a city of its own, larger than the one it surrounded. Then the siege truly began. Ottoman sappers dug trenches ever closer to the walls, working day and night under the cover of earthworks. They tunneled beneath the fortifications, planting explosives meant to shatter the bastions that protected Vienna. Cannons thundered without pause, pounding the defenses with an iron rain. Day after day, fireballs arced over the walls, reducing homes to ashes and filling the air with acrid smoke. Inside Vienna, the situation grew dire. Food supplies dwindled. Bread was rationed, meat almost non-existent. Disease spread quickly in the crowded shelters, carried by rats and unclean water. The smell of rot and smoke clung to every street. Yet, in spite of the hunger and the sickness, the spirit of the defenders did not collapse. At the center of the defense stood Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. Barely sleeping, always on the move along the ramparts, he became the symbol of Vienna's resistance. When panic threatened to break out, he was there with sharp words or a steadying hand. When soldiers faltered, he reminded them what was at stake. If Vienna fell, their families, their faith, and their homeland would follow. Starhemberg's orders were clear. There would be no surrender. Letters from the Grand Vizier offered terms, open the gates, and Vienna might be spared. But Starhemberg burned them, declaring that the city would fight to the last man rather than submit. The defenders fought with a desperate courage. They patched walls with earth and rubble, doused flames with buckets passed hand to hand, and counterattacked whenever Ottoman miners breached the defenses. Even the citizens, men, women, and children, joined in, carrying water, repairing barricades, and tending to the wounded. For weeks, the city held out against impossible odds. Each sunrise brought new bombardments, each night the dread of explosions beneath their feet. But Vienna stood, battered, starving, and sick, yet unbroken. And outside its walls, Kara Mustafa grew restless. Time was not on his side. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a relief army was gathering, and the fate of empires would soon be decided. Europe answers the call. As Vienna's walls groaned under the relentless Ottoman bombardment, messengers slipped through enemy lines, carrying desperate pleas for aid. The stakes were clear. If the city fell, the gateway to Europe would be open, and the Ottomans would march further west. The bells of Christendom rang with alarm. In Rome, Pope Innocent XI recognized the danger and acted swiftly. With fiery words, he called for a united Christian response, urging kings and princes to set aside rivalries and join together in defense of Europe. From his pulpit came not just a plea, but a declaration. This was not merely Vienna's struggle, it was civilization's last stand. One king heard the cry louder than all the rest, John III Sobieski of Poland. A seasoned warrior, brilliant strategist, and devout Catholic, Sobieski knew what was at stake. He had fought the Ottomans before and understood their might. To his nobles and soldiers, he declared with chilling clarity, "If Vienna falls today, Warsaw will fall tomorrow." His words cut through the hesitation. Poland would ride to war. Across the continent, alliances stirred. From Bavaria, Saxony, and the Rhineland came troops to swell the relief force. German princes rallied their banners, binding themselves to the cause. Yet, it was Sobieski who would command this coalition by reputation, by experience, and by the sheer force of his will. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa was certain of his victory. Vienna was crumbling, food was scarce, disease rampant. He believed no relief force could arrive in time. His arrogance blinded him to the storm gathering beyond the horizon. As August faded into September, dust clouds appeared on the roads to the north. Columns of armored horsemen, banners snapping in the wind, began to march toward the Danube. At their head rode Sobieski himself, clad in his famous Winged Hussar armor. The fate of Vienna and of Europe was about to be decided. The Allied army gathers. By early September, the forces of Christendom had converged into one vast host, nearly 70,000 soldiers strong. The banners of Poland, Bavaria, Saxony, and the small German states fluttered side by side, a rare sight in a Europe so often divided by politics and war. For once, rivalries were set aside. Every man in that army understood. The survival of Vienna, and perhaps of Europe itself, rested on their shoulders. At the heart of the army rode King John III Sobieski, armored in gleaming steel, with the great wings of his hussars towering behind him like the feathers of some avenging angel. His reputation as a commander preceded him. He had faced the Ottoman threat for years on the plains of Poland, and his soldiers trusted him without question. Now he was not only Poland's king, he was the commander of a coalition, the man chosen to stand against the might of Kara Mustafa's empire. On September 10, 1683, the Allied army crossed the Danube River. It was a logistical miracle. Tens of thousands of troops and their horses ferried across the wide waters in just 2 days. When they finally reached the Kahlenberg Heights, overlooking Vienna, the soldiers beheld a scene that froze their blood. Below them, the once proud city lay scarred and broken. Walls were shattered, smoke curled from burning rooftops, and the thunder of Ottoman cannons shook the earth. Inside, the defenders were at their breaking point. Starvation and disease had taken their toll, and yet Count Starhemberg and his weary garrison still held the walls with grim determination. But they could not last much longer. For Sobieski and his commanders, the decision was clear. The battle could not be delayed. Vienna was hanging by a thread, and every hour brought it closer to collapse. Sobieski gathered his officers and laid out the plan. The Allies would strike at dawn. The German troops would attack on the left, drawing Ottoman forces into battle, while Sobieski's Polish cavalry would sweep down from the heights, crashing into the enemy flank with unstoppable force. As the sun set on September 11th, tens of thousands of soldiers prepared for one of the most decisive battles in European history. Tomorrow, the hills of Kallenberg would echo with thunder, not from cannons, but from hooves. The battle begins September 12th, 1683. Dawn broke cold and gray over the hills of Kallenberg. Mist clung to the slopes, shrouding the Allied army as it stirred to life. Tens of thousands of men, their breath fogging in the morning air, tightened straps, sharpened blades, and whispered prayers. At first light, John III Sobieski gave the order. The battle for Vienna had begun. From the ridge, the Allied infantry surged downward in massive columns. Bavarian, Saxon, and German regiments advanced on the left, their drums pounding, their banners snapping in the wind. On the right, the Polish infantry moved steadily, their armor glinting like scales in the morning sun. Below, the Ottoman camp roared to life. Kara Mustafa Pasha's soldiers, Janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, and auxiliary troops from across the empire rushed to their positions. They had spent weeks building trenches, tunnels, and earthworks around Vienna, and now those same fortifications became the front lines of defense. Cannons roared, smoke billowed, and the valley shook with thunder as the two armies collided. The fighting was brutal, close, and merciless. The Janissaries, elite Ottoman infantry feared across the world, held their ground with disciplined volleys of musket fire. Against them surged the Bavarians and Saxons, hacking through barricades, musket balls ripping through their ranks. The Sipahi cavalry charged with curved sabers flashing, clashing with German horsemen in bloody melees across the plain. For hours, the battle seesawed. Neither side gained clear ground, but gradually, the weight of the coalition began to press forward. On the left flank, the Bavarians stormed Ottoman redoubts. On the right, the Poles battered at trenches and earthworks, pushing the defenders back step by step. And then, something remarkable happened. Inside Vienna, where the garrison had endured 2 months of starvation, disease, and endless bombardment, the defenders saw their chance. Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, gaunt from exhaustion but unbroken, ordered a sortie. The city gates burst open, and the Viennese soldiers charged out in a desperate counterattack. The coordination was perfect. As the coalition struck from the hills, the Viennese struck from the walls. The Ottomans suddenly found themselves attacked from both sides. Their lines wavered. What had begun as a confident defense was turning into a desperate struggle. Still, Kara Mustafa Pasha refused to retreat. He had brought 150,000 men across Europe for this moment. To abandon the siege now would be unthinkable. He hurled his reserves into the fray, urging his soldiers to hold at all costs. But above him, on the heights of Kallenberg, the true hammer of the Allied army was waiting. For all morning, Sobieski had held back his most feared weapon, the Polish Winged Hussars, 6,000 heavy cavalry, their lances gleaming, their wings of eagle and ostrich feathers arching high above their backs. They were Europe's shock troops, cavalry with the power to shatter entire armies in a single charge. Sobieski watched, waiting for the perfect moment. By early afternoon, it came. The Ottomans, already hard-pressed by the German and Polish infantry, were stretched thin. Their defenses buckled under the constant assaults. Kara Mustafa's men were tiring, his artillery running low on powder, his troops scattered across the battlefield. The moment of decision had arrived. Sobieski raised his arm. Trumpets blared. The hills shook. Like a tidal wave of steel and thunder, the largest cavalry charge in history began. 20,000 horsemen thundered down the slopes of Kallenberg, with Sobieski and his hussars at the very front. The earth itself seemed to tremble under their hooves. As they descended, the Allied infantry rallied and pressed forward, pinning the Ottomans in place. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to regroup. The Polish hussars lowered their lances, their wings shrieking in the wind. and slammed into the Ottoman flank with unstoppable force. The impact was catastrophic. Ottoman lines shattered like glass under a hammer. Soldiers were trampled, sabers flashed, banners fell. Panic swept through the Ottoman camp. What had begun as a siege turned, in an instant, into a rout. From the walls of Vienna, the defenders roared with hope. They surged forward again, joining the counterattack. The battle that had begun at dawn was now a storm of steel and chaos across the plains below. And as the sun sank lower, one thing became clear. The Siege of Vienna was about to end, not with the fall of the city, but with the crushing defeat of the Ottoman army. The charge of the Winged Hussars. As the afternoon sun burned through the mist, the valley below Kallenberg became a sea of chaos. Cannon smoke hung heavy, the cries of the wounded echoing across the fields. For hours the battle had raged in brutal stalemate, but now, the ground itself began to tremble. On the heights, King John III Sobieski had waited for this exact moment. The Ottomans were stretched thin, their lines bent and fraying under the relentless pressure of the Allied infantry. Kara Mustafa Pasha's proud army was no longer an organized host. It was a patchwork of exhausted, bleeding men desperately clinging to their positions. Sobieski's eyes narrowed. He raised his arm. A trumpet blast split the air. And then they came. 20,000 horsemen surged forward, the greatest cavalry charge in European history. At their heart thundered the Polish Winged Hussars, 6,000 elite knights clad in steel, their lances leveled, their massive warhorses pounding the earth like drums of doom. Each man bore the iconic wings, frames of eagle or ostrich feathers rising above their backs. As they descended, the wind caught these feathers, producing an eerie, shrieking roar. To friend and foe alike, it sounded as though a storm of angels, or demons, was crashing down upon the battlefield. The sight alone broke Ottoman morale. Kara Mustafa's soldiers, already battered and bloodied, now watched as a wall of armored horsemen descended like an avalanche of iron. Some tried to stand and fight. Others threw down their weapons and fled. It made no difference. The Hussars struck the Ottoman flank with devastating force. Lances splintered, sabers flashed, banners toppled. Entire regiments were smashed apart in seconds. Men and horses crushed beneath the weight of the charge. What had been a battle line became a sea of panic. Shouts of command drowned by screams of terror. Sobieski himself rode at the very front, his White Eagle standard flying high. He crashed into the heart of the Ottoman camp, cutting down foes with his saber. Around him, his cavalry ripped through enemy positions, overturning cannons, trampling tents, scattering thousands like leaves in a storm. Inside the Ottoman command tent, Kara Mustafa Pasha realized the unthinkable. The Siege of Vienna was lost. His dream of conquering Central Europe, of marching triumphantly into Christendom's heart, was collapsing in the dust. As the Hussars tore through his camp, the Grand Vizier abandoned the field. Surrounded by a small guard, he fled eastward, leaving his army to be slaughtered or captured. By sunset, the great Ottoman host had disintegrated. What had begun as a proud army of 150,000 men was now a broken, fleeing mob. The battlefield was littered with abandoned cannons, shattered standards, and the bodies of the fallen. On the walls of Vienna, defenders wept with relief. Bells rang out across the city. Against all odds, the city had survived. And in the valley below, the Winged Hussars had carved their legend into history forever. The Battle of Vienna was over. Europe had been saved, not by walls alone, but by a king, his allies, and a thunderous charge that shattered an empire's ambition. The fall of the Ottoman army. As the sun dipped low on September 12, 1683, the once mighty Ottoman army dissolved into chaos. What had begun as the grandest siege Europe had ever seen now ended in a catastrophic rout. The soldiers who had marched proudly beneath the crescent banners just weeks earlier now scattered across the Danube plains in a desperate flight for survival. The great Ottoman camp, sprawling like a city of tents, stocked with food, treasure, and siege artillery, was abandoned in haste. Cannons stood silent, wagons overturned, and mountains of supplies were left behind. The invincible image of the Sultan's army shattered as soldiers threw away their weapons, tore off their armor, and ran. Horses bolted, carts broke apart in the mud, and in the panic, comrades trampled one another. The Holy League troops, fueled by the fury of the siege and the memory of starving comrades within Vienna, showed no mercy. Polish cavalry and German infantry pursued relentlessly, cutting down fugitives by the thousands. The rout became a massacre. Along the riverbanks and in the forests, Ottoman soldiers were hunted down, their cries echoing through the night. What had been a disciplined army of nearly 150,000 was reduced to a scattering of broken survivors. Inside Vienna, the moment of liberation was almost surreal. Just hours earlier, its citizens had faced the prospect of annihilation. Starvation gnawed at their bellies, disease stalked their streets, and the Ottoman mines had nearly broken through the walls. Now, as news spread that the enemy camp was in flames, church bells rang wildly. People poured into the streets, weeping, embracing, and singing hymns of thanksgiving. The defenders, exhausted and bloodied, raised their swords in triumph from the ramparts. Vienna had not only survived, it had been delivered at the very brink of destruction. For Kara Mustafa Pasha, the defeat was total. He had gambled everything on the fall of Vienna, convinced that once the Habsburg capital fell, all of Central Europe would open before the Ottoman Crescent. Instead, he was now a fugitive, retreating eastward under the cover of darkness. His army supplies, his siege guns, his dream of conquest, everything had been left in the mud of the Vienna plain. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Vienna was saved, but more than that, the psychological tide had turned. Across Europe, the victory was celebrated as nothing less than divine intervention. The myth of Ottoman invincibility had been broken. No longer was Christendom cowering behind its fortresses. The great empire of the East had been driven back. The field outside Vienna bore witness to this turning point. Where once the Ottoman host had camped, there now lay only ruins, charred tents, abandoned banners, and the bodies of the fallen. It was not just a military defeat. It was a humiliation so profound that it would haunt the empire for generations. From the smoke and ashes of that battlefield, a new chapter in European history began. The Siege of Vienna had ended, and with it, the era of unstoppable Ottoman expansion. When the dust settled over the plains of Vienna, the scale of what had just occurred slowly began to dawn upon Europe. For months, the Ottoman Empire had seemed unstoppable. Their armies had marched across Hungary, their banners had risen outside the gates of Vienna, and their cannons had shaken the very walls of Christendom. Yet on that September day in 1683, the tide of history shifted. Vienna had been saved, not by walls alone, but by a coalition of kings, princes, soldiers, and citizens who refused to yield. The immediate consequence was simple. The Ottoman dream of conquering Central Europe had been shattered. Never again would the sultans of Constantinople march so far into the heart of the continent. The empire that had once threatened Rome itself was now thrown onto the defensive, its aura of invincibility broken. What had been envisioned as a triumphant entry into Europe's greatest cities instead ended in disgrace, with tents burned, cannons lost, and the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha condemned to death for his failure. In contrast, John III Sobieski of Poland emerged as a living legend. His ride into battle with the Winged Hussars became the stuff of myth. Chroniclers described his charge from the Kahlenberg Hills as the thunder that broke the crescent. In paintings, he was depicted as a savior of Christendom, the warrior king whose intervention had turned the course of history. His words before the battle, "If Vienna falls, so too will Warsaw," echoed as prophecy fulfilled, a declaration that he had defended not just one city, but all of Europe. The Winged Hussars, already famed in Poland, now entered the realm of legend across the continent. Their charge, 20,000 armored horsemen descending like an iron storm, was remembered as the greatest cavalry assault in European history. The sound of their wings, the glitter of their lances, and the sheer power of their momentum became symbols of Christian resilience and martial glory. Even centuries later, the image of Sobieski at the head of his hussars remained one of the most enduring icons of the battle. Beyond the battlefield, the Siege of Vienna had profound political consequences. The Holy League, forged under the blessing of Pope Innocent XI, gained new strength and momentum. The coalition of Catholic powers, Poland, Austria, Venice, and later Russia, began a coordinated counteroffensive that would, over the next decades, drive the Ottomans steadily back. Hungary, Transylvania, and much of the Balkans were reclaimed. The once relentless Ottoman advance was rolled back, step by step, until the empire's borders receded to the Balkans. For Europe, this was more than a military victory. It was a cultural and psychological turning point. Vienna, which had stood as the frontier fortress between East and West, now symbolized resilience and unity. The victory emboldened the Habsburg dynasty, solidified Poland's role as a defender of Christendom, and marked the beginning of a new European order, one in which the Ottoman threat no longer loomed as it once had. But the legacy was not only triumphal. For the Ottomans, the defeat marked the beginning of a slow but undeniable decline. No longer feared as the unstoppable power that had taken Constantinople and pressed into Europe, the empire's military and political authority began to fracture. Internal rivalries deepened, reforms stalled, and defeats multiplied. The Siege of Vienna, once intended as a gateway to dominance, instead became remembered as the moment when Ottoman expansion reached its limit. Centuries later, historians would look back on 1683 as a watershed moment in European history. Without Vienna's survival, the cultural and political landscape of the continent might have been unrecognizable. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, even the very idea of modern Europe, all might have unfolded differently under Ottoman rule. Instead, the defeat preserved a balance of power that allowed Europe to flourish on its own path. As the bells of Vienna rang in celebration on that September night, few could have grasped the full meaning of what had been won. Yet in hindsight, the significance is clear. The Siege of Vienna was not just a battle, it was a turning point. It was the moment Europe stood its ground, the moment an empire met its limit, and the moment a new chapter of history began. And so, the legacy of Vienna endures, a tale of desperation turned to triumph, of warriors whose charge became legend, and of a city whose survival changed the destiny of a continent.